In September of 2020, America's disaster response system did something it was never designed to do. It fought a hurricane and a historic wildfire crisis at the exact same time in different corners of the country with the exact same limited pool of emergency resources. That's not a hypothetical scenario. That's a real week in recent American history, and it exposed something disturbing that most people never think about until it's already happening to them. The nation's entire disaster response system was built around the assumption that catastrophes mostly happen one at a time. They don't anymore. And when two major disasters hit simultaneously, the math behind who gets help and how fast changes in ways that should concern everyone living in a disaster-prone region. Let's be precise before we go further, because this deserves careful explanation rather than dramatic exaggeration. This isn't a claim that disaster response has collapsed. And what we're going to walk through is how simultaneous disasters actually strain the system differently than single events, why that strain has become more common in recent years, and what it means for anyone counting on federal or state emergency. Resources arriving quickly when their own disaster hits. Start with how disaster response is actually built to work, because most people only think about it in the abstract until they need it directly. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, along with state and local emergency management systems, operates on a resource sharing model: personnel, equipment, funding, and specialized response. Teams are treated as a shared national pool, deployed to wherever the greatest need exists at any given moment. That model works efficiently when disasters are staggered, allowing resources to flow from a recovering region toward a newly affected one. It works far less efficiently when two or more major disasters strike simultaneously in different parts of the country, forcing the exact same limited pool of specialized personnel and equipment to be split between multiple active crises at once. Now understand what that actually looked like in September of 2020. The American West was in the middle of one of the most severe wildfire seasons in modern history, with historic fires burning simultaneously across California, Oregon, and Washington, destroying homes, displacing tens of thousands of residents, and blanketing much of the West Coast in hazardous smoke for weeks. At the exact same time, the Atlantic hurricane season was producing an unusually active string of storms, including Hurricane Laura, which struck Louisiana as one of the most powerful storms to hit the state in decades, followed shortly afterward by additional storms threatening the Gulf Coast. Smoke from the western wildfires that September was so extensive it darkened skies over cities as far away as Denver and even reached the East Coast in reduced but measurable concentrations, a visible reminder of just how large-scale the crisis had become, even before accounting for the simultaneous hurricane threat unfolding along the opposite side of the country. Emergency operations. Centers on both coasts found themselves managing historic, headline-dominating disasters in the exact same news cycle, competing not just for physical resources, but for public attention and political urgency as well. Read that again slowly. Two entirely different categories of catastrophic disaster, thousands of miles apart, drawing from the exact same national pool of firefighting resources: emergency personnel and disaster. Relief funding, during the exact same handful of weeks. That kind of geographic distance is part of what makes this pattern so counterintuitive to most people. A hurricane in Louisiana and a wildfire in California feel, on the surface, like they belong to entirely separate stories with no real connection between them. But from the perspective of the national agencies responsible for responding to both, they're competing claims on the exact same finite set of resources, arriving at the exact same moment. Here's where it gets disturbing. Emergency management officials during that period were explicit about the strain this created. Personnel and specialized equipment that would normally be available to surge quickly toward a single major disaster instead had to be divided between the wildfire crisis in the West and the hurricane crisis along the Gulf Coast, slowing response capacity in both regions compared to what a single isolated disaster would have allowed. That's not a failure of any individual agency's competence. It's a structural limitation built into a system sized around historical disaster patterns that increasingly don't match the frequency and simultaneity of extreme weather events showing up in recent years. Acknowledging that limitation isn't an attack on the people doing the actual response work, who are frequently operating under intense pressure with genuine skill and dedication. It's an honest recognition that the system's overall capacity was never sized for the world it's now being asked to operate in. But that's not even the most concerning part of this pattern. This kind of overlap isn't a rare one-time coincidence. Climate researchers and emergency management officials have both pointed to an increasing trend of overlapping disaster seasons, wildfire season in the West extending longer into what used to be a quieter period, colliding more frequently with an Atlantic hurricane season that has also shown increased activity in numerous recent years. Let that land for a second. The two disaster seasons that once operated on largely separate calendars Wildfire risk peaking in late summer and fall in the west, hurricane risk peaking in late summer and fall along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts are increasingly overlapping in timing, precisely because both seasons have been extending and intensifying in ways connected to the same broader warming trend. Fire seasons across the western United States have grown measurably longer in recent decades, according to data tracked by federal fire agencies extending further into both spring and late fall compared to historical averages from just a few decades ago. Meanwhile, Atlantic hurricane seasons have produced an increasing number of storms in several recent years compared to 20th century averages, driven in part by warmer ocean temperatures providing more fuel for storm development. The combination means the historical assumption of largely separate disaster calendars is becoming less reliable with each passing year. To understand why this overlap matters so much beyond a single dramatic news cycle, you have to understand how disaster response funding and staffing actually get allocated in real time. FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund operates with a finite budget that Congress periodically replenishes, and while the agency works to avoid running dry during active response periods, multiple simultaneous large-scale disasters place unusually intense pressure on that funding pool within the exact same fiscal window. Similarly, specialized personnel like wildland firefighting crews, urban search and rescue teams, and disaster medical assistance teams exist in genuinely limited numbers nationwide. These aren't resources that can simply be created on demand during a crisis. They're highly trained specialists who take years to develop, meaning when two major disasters compete for the same limited pool simultaneously, actual physical scarcity, not just funding, becomes a real constraint on response speed. Wildland firefighters, in particular, represent a workforce that's genuinely difficult to expand quickly. Training a qualified firefighting crew, capable of safely operating on the fire lines, takes months of specialized instruction. And the total national workforce, while substantial is finite enough that a historically severe fire season can already stretch it thin even without a competing disaster demanding some of those same personnel and aircraft resources elsewhere in the country. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who wants to understand how disaster response actually works instead of just reacting to the headlines when it fails. That's exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. So go ahead and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one. Now, let's be careful about what this pattern actually means, because that precision protects you from both complacency and unnecessary panic. This isn't a claim that disaster response completely breaks down whenever two events overlap. FEMA and state agencies have developed increasingly sophisticated coordination systems specifically to manage multi-disaster scenarios, and mutual aid agreements between states allow some flexibility in sharing resources even during simultaneous crises. What is genuinely true and confirmed repeatedly by emergency management officials themselves is that response speed and resource availability measurably decrease for any individual disaster when it's competing with another major event happening at the same time. That's not a worst-case hypothetical. It's a documented operational reality that has played out multiple times in recent American disaster history. That distinction matters enormously for how you should think about your own personal disaster preparedness. If your region is hit during a period when it's the only active major disaster in the country, historical response times give you a reasonable baseline expectation. If your disaster hits during a period when another major event is unfolding elsewhere, that same baseline expectation may not hold, and building an additional personal preparedness margin becomes considerably more important. So, what does this actually mean for anyone living in a disaster-prone region, whether that's wildfire country in the West, hurricane-exposed coastline along the Gulf or Atlantic, or any other area with elevated extreme weather risk? It means self-sufficiency in the immediate aftermath of a disaster matters more than ever, precisely because you cannot assume outside help will arrive on the same timeline it might have decades ago. So, what can you actually do with this information? Start by building a genuinely robust emergency kit capable of sustaining your household for at least a full week, rather than the often cited minimum of 72 hours, since overlapping national disasters can meaningfully extend the timeline before significant outside assistance reaches your specific community. Familiarize yourself with your region's specific evacuation routes and emergency shelters well before disaster season begins, since local resources, rather than distant federal ones, are typically the first line of response regardless of what else is happening nationally. And knowing exactly how your local system operates gives you a real advantage. It also helps to identify multiple possible evacuation routes, rather than relying on a single option, since a scenario involving overlapping regional disasters can sometimes affect infrastructure or road capacity in ways a single, isolated event wouldn't, and having a backup plan reduces the risk of getting caught without a viable path out if your primary route becomes compromised or congested. Consider your own insurance coverage carefully, including flood, fire, and wind coverage, specific to your region's dominant risks. since delayed federal disaster declarations or funding during periods of overlapping national disasters can meaningfully slow the availability of certain federal assistance programs compared to a single isolated event. And here's the step people consistently underestimate. Build a genuine community-level support network with neighbors before disaster strikes, since local mutual aid, checking on each other, sharing resources, and coordinating informally, has repeatedly proven to be one of the most effective bridges during exactly the kind of delayed formal response window that overlapping national disasters can create. That kind of informal network costs nothing to build and often proves more reliable in the first critical hours than any formal system, precisely because neighbors are already on the ground, already aware of who might need extra help, and don't need to wait for outside resources to arrive before taking action. Before you go, let us know in the comments if you've ever experienced a disaster in your area while another major one was unfolding elsewhere in the country, because this overlap is becoming more common than most people realize. And if you want to keep tracking how disaster response systems adapt to this new reality, stay subscribed, because we'll be following this story closely as it continues to develop. Let's close where we started, a hurricane tearing through the Gulf Coast, a historic wildfire crisis burning across the West. The same week. The same limited pool of resources split in two directions at once. That's not a freak coincidence anymore. It's an increasingly familiar reality, and the system built to handle one disaster at a time is being asked to do something it was never fully designed for. That's the uncomfortable truth worth carrying with you long after this story ends. The question isn't whether America's disaster response system can handle a single major catastrophe. It clearly can, and has, many times over. The real question, the one this pattern keeps forcing into the open, is what happens when it has to handle two at once. And increasingly, that's no longer a rare exception to plan around. It's becoming the new normal to plan for.